Okay, Marie, you're up.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to webinar 2. We're really excited that you're here with us for Hack the Gates for our second webinar. It's really exciting to see the interest in what we're doing. Hi, am I? Hi. And
You're good. Marie?
Hi, everyone. I seem to be having just some weirdness with my audio. Anyhow, sorry about that. Welcome to webinar 2. Like I was saying, we're so excited by the interest in hacking the gates, that folks want to hear what's going on, and so they're excited about the many things that we're talking about just doing. So we're here to talk with some of the most interesting researchers who are out there right now working on issues of access in college and really kind of pulling apart the things that are actually happening. You know, I think as Varsity Blues, as these issues popped up, we realized as practitioners especially that no one was surprised by anything that was going on. No one was surprised that people were taking advantage of loopholes in the system, and that there were some strong advantages for things that came with whiteness and wealth. But I think with Varsity Blues, it really honed in on for a lot of people. And I think folks who perhaps didn't believe for so long that there were barriers in that path to higher ed, that, oh my gosh, yeah, there are a lot of barriers in that path to higher ed for the vast majority of folks here. So none of us were surprised, but let's really dig into some of those pieces that are evidence that that the system is in desperate need of some reformation. And so tonight we have Davin Sweeny of CollegeWise, and also podcaster extraordinaire of The Crush, a great podcast. If you haven't listened, give it a try. And Davin's going to lead us through a conversation with some outstanding folks. And so Davin, turning it over to you.
Hey, thanks. Hi, folks. Thanks everybody for being here. I'm Davin Sweeny. I am a college counselor at CollegeWise in New York City. As Marie mentioned, I'm also the host of the Crush podcast about college and college admissions. Marie was on it, so you guys can listen to her again if you want after this. I am moderating this event. We're joined by some amazing researchers whose work we're really proud to highlight tonight. People who've spent a lot of time examining and publishing information about the practices of admissions offices that we all hope will complicate and problematize our understanding of the admissions recruitment landscape in a constructive way, such that we can understand how certain practices are contributing to class and race inequalities. So our goal for this webinar is for you guys to take all of this stuff into consideration as we think about ways to engage in more equity-centered enrollment management and implement those practices in our work. So to help us get there, we are joined by Dr. Ted Thornill, professor of sociology at Florida Gulf Coast University, who recently published an article titled, "We Want Black Students, Just Not You, How White Admissions Counselors Screen Black Prospective Students." Dr. Ozan Jaquette, assistant professor of education at UCLA, and Dr. Karina Salazar, assistant professor of education at the University of Arizona Center for the Study of Higher Education, both of whom have been working on a project mining data and digging deep into how and where admissions offices do their recruiting. And of course, Dr. OiYan Poon of Colorado State University Center for Race and Intersectional Studies in Higher Education, or RISE, who will talk to us tonight about selective race-conscious holistic admissions practices. So we have a ton to talk about and nowhere near enough time. So I'm just going to turn it right over to Professors Jaquette and Salazar to get us started in discussing their research in enrollment management, recruiting, and access, which you can check out at emraresearch.com. It is an amazing resource, especially if you're a map fan, that you can get lost in for hours. So maybe wait until after the webinar to do so. So with that, take it away, you guys.
Great, thank you so much. Good afternoon, everyone. I guess good evening for some. So my name is Karina Salazar. Ozan and I's project focuses on analyzing university admissions, recruiting visits. This is when colleges and universities send representatives across the country to present at high schools and attend college fairs in order to meet with prospective students and solicit admissions applications. And so the admissions scandal has focused so much of the attention on some of the illegal ways in which wealthy and predominantly white students have a leg up in accessing higher education institutions. Meanwhile, mainstream policy debates about the causes of access inequality tend to focus on the so-called deficiencies of low-income students and students of color and under-resourced schools, but neither of these discourses really address the ways in which colleges and universities contribute in very significant and legal ways to these advantages and disadvantages in accessing higher education institutions. And so many colleges and universities say that they are deeply committed to providing equitable access by way of statements and policies, but drawing from research on organizational behavior, these statements and policies can often be ceremonial efforts meant to appease external stakeholders, whereas substantive efforts that allocate internal resources can be more reliable indicators of organizational priorities. And so our project, we argue that an alternative explanation for access inequality is that enrollment priorities of colleges and universities are biased against low-income students and students of color. And so we know that universities are very purposeful about which students they pursue and spend substantial resources crafting their incoming classes. And so knowing which student populations are targeted by recruiting efforts yields credible indicators about the enrollment priorities of colleges and universities. And so I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Can you all see my screen? Okay. And so, Ozan and I and our research team, we analyzed the 2017 recruiting visits for 15 public research universities as part of a report released in the spring with the support from the Joyce Foundation. And we found that most of the 15 universities in the study make many more out-of-state recruiting visits than in-state visits. And so this graph you see on my screen displays the income disparities between public high schools that received a recruiting visit in the yellow and the public high schools that did not receive a visit in the blue by in-state and out-of-state for the 15 universities in the study. And so across all 15 universities, out-of-state public high schools that received a visit are located in communities with much higher median household incomes on average than schools that did not receive a visit. This income bias is also evident within in-state recruiting visits, although to a lesser magnitude than out-of-state visits. And these patterns hold even after controlling for other factors that may influence whether or not a school is likely to receive a recruiting visit. Examples, this includes enrollment size and student achievement. And so we also analyzed recruiting visits by the racial ethnic makeup of schools. And so this visual is also similar here to the income graph I just showed. It shows the racial disparities in enrollment between public high schools that received a visit versus those that did not. And so nearly for out-of-state public high schools here, nearly all universities in the study visited out-of-state public schools that on average enrolled smaller proportions of Black and Latinx students than schools not visited. And this pattern also held even after we controlled for other factors, other characteristics of public high schools. And then within in-state, while some in-state visits did exhibit patterns of racial bias, this finding was not as consistent across universities in the study for in-state public high school visits. And then, so we can also see these income and racial disparities in recruiting visits geographically. So here, I've pulled up a map of the Chicago metropolitan area. You're looking at recruiting visits by Rutgers University in 2017. And so each of the dots represent public high schools in the Chicago area, The filled in dots represent visits by Rutgers versus the hollow dots represent schools that did not receive a visit. And so the color layer here you'll see is median household income at the zip code level, with the darker blue shades indicating the highest income zip codes in the Chicago area. And you can see a lot of these visits are concentrated in the northern suburbs of Chicago, whereas nearly, I think, one maybe high school in the southern part of the metro received a visit. And so if we look at the Chicago metropolitan area now by race, ethnicity here, we see similar patterns. And so this is recruiting visits by the University of Pittsburgh in Chicago, with the yellow areas indicating the zip codes with higher proportions of white populations, subpopulations. And so here we see similar trends where the blue filled dots indicate high school visits versus some of the hollow dots indicate high schools that did not receive a visit. And so where the majority of population of color on the southern part of Chicago, that's the biggest cluster of non-visited high schools. Ozan, you want to take over?
All right. Hi, everyone. Ozan Jaquette, assistant professor at UCLA. I guess it's my turn. I'll share a screen too, but I just have I'm just going to share a very long quote. And here we are. This is a quote from Max Weber. He's a famous German sociologist, and he was writing this in, I think, this is 1921, but he died in 1920, so that doesn't make sense. But anyways, Max was writing about this transition to like modernization, where resources can't be allocated purely by hereditary position, and he viewed education credentials as the key by which people with property, rich people, people of noble class name, they get to keep the opportunities. And so he talked about the who has the credentials, that's who gets the privileged spots in businesses. And he, just to quote, I have the highlighted part, the bolded part, when we hear from all sides the demand for an introduction of regular curricula and special examinations, the reason behind it is not, of course, a suddenly awakened thirst for education, but a desire for restricting the supply of these positions and their monopolization by the owners of educational certificates. And finally, as the education prerequisites to the acquisition of certificates requires considerable expense and a period of waiting for enumeration, this development of educational certificates means a setback for talent in favor of property. And I want to think about this quote in relation to how we think of admissions and enrollment management, also the varsity blues scandal in general. First off, and OiYan, please just cut me off, whenever. But first off, it seems that, let's see, where was I? First off, the example of the varsity blues, it seems like a clear example of, just how can we give affluent people an opportunity to buy their way into these elite credentials that are going to guarantee success in later life. And one thing that other folks have been pushing me to think about is, has access and social mobility ever been a serious goal of colleges and universities? So like, I'm a higher ed researcher and I'm an access researcher, so that's what I care about. But sometimes I think folks in my position and other people who are proponents of access, we think that is kind of course that should be the goal, and there is this beautiful past that adhered to this goal, but now it doesn't. And I think we see looking back historically from what Weber was saying in Germany, that the goal was never to increase equality of opportunity. The goal was to say, here, you have this credential in order to get this job, and you can only get that job if you have the credential. It's a way of restricting opportunity. And so I think it just becomes something that we should think, have things ever changed? Has varsity blues is an example of purely giving opportunity for those with property, with financial means, and has this changed? I'll stop there, and we can maybe talk about this more later on.
There was a question that I just want to bring up that might be best addressed at Karina at this point, that one of the viewers wondered if it appeared that Asians might be overrepresented in visits. Can you comment on that?
Yeah, so it looks for these 15 universities. Yeah, they tend to visit schools that are on average a higher proportion of Asian students than schools that are not visited.
Okay. Thank you for cleaning that up. And again, on the matter of asking questions, please feel free to ask in the chat box. You can also utilize the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen to ask questions privately, and we'll go ahead and collect all of these and get to them before time is out. Do you want to pass it over at this point to Ted?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you, guys.
Well, hello, everybody. I'm Ted Thornill, Associate Professor of Sociology at Florida Gulf Coast University. I'm going to share some slides with you now. Are you able to see these?
Yes.
So I'm going to share with you the results of a paper that was published last year entitled, "We Want Black Students, Just Not You, How White Admissions Counselors Screen Black Prospective Students." And so this study began when I was working as assistant professor at St. Olaf College in Northfield, Minnesota. And I was experiencing many of the difficulties that Black and non-Black faculty, staff, and students of color experience on these predominantly and historically white college campuses. And around that time, I was also reading this book by two legal scholars, Devin Carbato and Mitu Galati, called Acting White, Rethinking Race in Post-Racial America. And it stimulated my thinking because when I was at this institution, students would frequently come and tell me about the racism they had experienced in their dorm rooms, in their classrooms, from faculty members, from other students. And I was hired to teach courses on race and racism, but I seemed to rub the administration the wrong way there, and a lot of the faculty as well, because I was a little perhaps too candid in my approach to these topics. And so it was these two topics together, the experiences of reading this book and working at this selective liberal arts college that was a Norwegian Lutheran school that was almost monolithically white. That was the genesis of this study. And so I'm going to give you a little background on the theory that I was engaged with, which is called intraracial discrimination. And the central argument is that most people in the US believe we now live in a post-racial society. I know most of y'all tuned in now realize it's ridiculous proposition, but they do. But still, even though they think race doesn't matter, they have this strong desire, and we know that's ridiculous, that race still does matter, and that there is institutional racism within institutions of higher education and the labor market and other social institutions. So even though there's this interracial discrimination that's still occurring, these organizations do want some racial diversity. They just want a particular type. And so this report from the Chronicle of Higher Ed in 2014 showed the enrollment goals of private institutions, and 86% of them indicated that they had the goal of enrolling diverse students. And we know that this means basically Black and sometimes Latino students. This is what they mean. It refers to race principally. And nearly 9 out of 10 of these respondents indicated that their institutions had realized or exceeded their goal. So we know that these organizations want some Black students, but they prefer a particular type. And Carbato and Galati contend that organizations desire Blacks who are less racially salient, ones that they perceive as being less concerned with issues of race and racism, because those individuals won't be perceived to be racial rabble rousers. And so those individuals would be more palatable and more desirable to have within their institutions. Here's an example of somebody that you might imagine as being more palatable, and another individual, Angela Davis, being less palatable than Condoleezza Rice. I realize these are extremes, but just to give you the flavor of what they're talking about in short order. Again, Ben Carson, more palatable. Colin Kaepernick and Eric Reed, less palatable. because they're more racially salient. And this is not necessarily a partisan thing. You could place Barack Obama in the center between these two. So it can be understood as a continuum too. But there are negative consequences for these racially salient Blacks, so say Carbato and Galati. However, the types of negative experiences that they speak about, employment, college admissions, principally, but also the provision of services and public treatment, are not really, they're not empirically investigated in the book. So it's basically just strong theory and some examples of case law that they highlight. And it was convincing, but we needed an empirical test. And so these negative consequences can be reduced for if Blacks choose to work their identity to allay whites' racial fears. And so some Black folks do that, some don't. These are the types of individuals here that the book suggests, the theory suggests, would be less desirable students at historically white institutions, individuals that would be protesting, challenging white authority over injustice on campus. And so the two general motivating research questions I had were, do white college admissions counselors intraracially screen Black prospective students based on their degree of racial salience? And if so, are these counselors less responsive to Black students who reveal an interest in anti-racism and racial justice? What I did is I used the audit research approach, particularly the correspondence study, where it's a quasi-experimental design that enables the determination of causation. And what I did is I used fictitious Black prospective students who communicated with white college admissions counselors via email. These are the names you can see here used in the study that were on these various emails. And these names originated from census data, Social Security Administration data, several states' departments of public health that publish popular baby names by race, previous studies, and some that we just created ourselves. And these were the names of traditionally gendered male and female names that had 95% approximately agreement with what we wanted these names to represent, which was Black students and what a predominantly upper middle class white population thought that they were indeed Black. And then I had to come up with emails, narratives to communicate with these counselors. So the first of these was the non-racially salient emails. And they all asked about whether they would be a good fit based on their interests. The nondescript email or narrative communicated an interest in English and math. They were involved as an assistant editor for the student newspaper, and they were a math tutor at a local library. The next one is environmental sustainability. That was actually a little tricky trying to find a Black woman hugging a tree, but I found it on Google. It was mostly white women, but I needed the Black woman for this one here. They were interested in biology and environmental science, and they were president of Students for Environmental Awareness, a student club, and they're also involved in Greenhouse Planning Committee, and they were engaged in activism in their community around sustainability, take back the tap, getting rid of plastic water bottles. Then the next one was a narrative called what I call racial unity. This narrative demonstrated an interest in African-American history and culture and culturally resonant African-American involvement, such as the school jazz band and gospel choir. And important here is to note that this particular narrative had the phrase cross-cultural understanding, which was meant to moderate this individual's racial salience. Like, can't we all just get along? Lastly was the racially salient narrative, which what I called anti-racist. This narrative communicated an interest in racial justice, African-American culture and politics, so it was politically Black, not simply culturally Black. They were involved in anti-racist student organization and the BSO on campus, and they were involved as the youngest member of a community-based organization fighting for racial justice along the lines of education and criminal and justice reform. Next, I needed to identify a sample of college counselors. So we had a total of 517 white admissions counselors at small to medium private HPWIs. In the interest of time, I'll limit it. I can answer questions about the details of how we went about doing this, but it involved an inter-rater reliability analysis so that we could be confident in their kind of racial ascription as white individuals. Open to talking about that more later. But you can see there the diversity of the states and the number of cities that these counselors represented. Each counselor received 2 emails separated by approximately a month. And here are the overall findings, some of the most important findings in the interest of time. Overall, only 60% of these counselors actually responded to the emails. So that was a very surprising thing to me at first. I mean, you send 100 emails, I didn't think that only 60 of them would generate a response. I shared that with a vice president of enrollment at a private institution. This individual became very concerned that they were basically leaving money on the table, that these folks need to be responding to all these inquiries that they get, because most of them are not researchers doing audit studies. Here's the response rates for the first 3 narratives. And you can see here that approximately 2/3 response rate for these 3, and these are statistically indistinct from one another. However, the response rate for the anti-racist narrative was only 48% overall. So you see the 17% difference. When we look at the responses from white counselors, white male counselors, only 58%. Similar response rates for the first 3, and an even lower response rate for the anti-racist narrative, which was more racially salient, 23% percentage point difference. White women counselors, 62% response rate, again, very similar response rate for the first 3 narratives, and slightly higher than before. But again, and you see this recurring pattern, and in every way you slice the data, the anti-racist narrative was always the least likely to generate a response. This, I'll leave you with this one here. This was the most powerful finding, with white male counselors responding to Black women interested in sustainability activism, 74% response rate. And their responsiveness to anti-racist narrative was only 37%. So they were twice as likely, these white male counselors, to respond to Black women interested in fighting to save the planet, as opposed to Black women wanting to fight for their people. So basically, I found that Black students who reveal an anti-racist ethic or politics are treated less favorably. And I think this is a conservative estimate of this practice, because it takes little to simply respond to an email, whether it's boilerplate and curt or comprehensive and substantive and targeted. So what happens when they actually are applying? I think it's probably even worse, but that would be an empirical question. OiYan, let me know on time when I'm out of time.
No, you got a couple more minutes. You're good.
Okay. So I also wonder what's going on with recommendation letters, because they're going to be racialized as well. And the practice of instructors in classrooms, for instance, at all levels of education. Basically, the theory that I tested suggests that this kind of intraracial screening practice is happening across social institutions and settings. And so I think this is like a form of new racism. It's like a new racism practice. It's not whether or not whites want to completely exclude a particular group, but it's the type of individuals that they're willing to embrace, and their willingness to embrace different non-white individuals is based on their palatability, which means don't stir the racial waters. And if you do, then that's going to be distasteful to a large segment of the white population. And I think probably many institutions, and within higher ed specifically, have been infected or are infected with this kind of practice. So we need more research to clarify the reach and how this practice actually unfolds in additional settings beyond simply the inquiry stage of the college admissions process. And I'll leave you with that.
All right. Thank you, Ted. Davin, do you want to ask any questions from the audience before I get started, or should I go ahead?
I think this is a good, I mean, I think the ones that came up would be probably best asked down the road, because there's some good fodder for discussion. So.
All right, then. Well, I will keep it rolling then. All right. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us for webinar 2. I'm a little bit nervous tonight because this is the first time I'm publicly sharing anything from this Spencer-funded project called Inside the Black Box. A long time ago, far, far away, I was a low-level admissions reader, and I noticed that the way the public and the media talk about admissions assumptions that were made was very different than what I was seeing in the work that I was doing. And it makes sense because, especially now, increasingly so, it's such a litigious environment and it's just such a heated topic that I think admissions professionals can't really talk about or correct any incorrect assumptions in the public media or the legal arena. It's just very dangerous. And so I designed this study as a constructivist study, meaning that I was asking admissions professionals to share with me how exactly does race-conscious holistic admissions work. So this is from the perspectives of your colleagues, your being admissions professionals out there. And so this is the central question: how does it work according to admissions professionals? I'm still in the midst of finishing up interviews. By November 12th, I think I will have 51 interviews, and that's it, because these interviews are going long. It's like 2 hours each. People got a lot to say. And so the recruitment targeted admissions professionals at Selective institution is practicing race-conscious admissions. So of course, then places in public institutions in Michigan and California and 6 other states were excluded from the recruitment, even if they did hit the selectivity level, which was 40% or lower admission rate. So I'm still in the midst of these interviews. There's 4 areas in the interviews that I'm asking questions about. 1 is professional background. 2 is I ask people to tell me a little bit about the evaluation criteria or rubrics that, if they're used, trying to get at what the values are behind the evaluation of applicants in their processes that they're familiar with. And some of these people have been working at more than, some have worked at 1 place, others have worked at 3 or even more places in their careers. So they're answering questions from those experiences. The 3rd section of the interview protocol is around the admission cycle, or essentially what happens to each file when it comes in, whether, and then they walk me through early decision, what happens to files, regular decision, what happens to files, basically give me the choose your own adventure of possibilities of the review evaluation process. And then 4th, and the final section is around training and norming or calibration. So how do you know that you're getting essentially confidence and iterator reliability in applying the criteria or rubrics in evaluating applicants? So those are the 4 sections of the interview, and throughout I ask questions about how does race fit into all of these, all the segments of the admissions review process. So these are very, very preliminary gut instinct based findings. And I'm going to focus on the stages of selective admissions tonight. There's just a lot of data that we haven't been even able to really start. We've only started analyzing. My research team, which includes folks like Nikki Chun and Douglas Lee, who's on this webinar tonight. So we're only starting to analyze the data, but for tonight, I'm going to talk about the stages of selective admissions that seems to be coming through. And perhaps I think for a lot of practitioners, this is not necessarily going to be like earth-shattering news, but institutional priorities, goals, and parameters shape the evaluation criteria. So what they're evaluating for, what they're looking for in applicants is very much driven by what is prioritized, what are the parameters of each individual institution. The next stage is the review or evaluation of individual applicants. And here, I think this is where previous research and lawsuits have mostly focused on, is how the review and evaluation process happens. And what's coming through very clearly is I have this context. Context has been the central word. In other words, in the evaluation and review process, people are telling me that they're trying to understand each student within the context of their schools, within the context of their communities, so that they're not unfairly, or what they're saying is they're hoping not to unfairly evaluate students from different types of high schools, geographies, so on and so forth. There's kind of 2 models of review, again, not earth-shattering information. But there's, for the most part, it's still very common for selective institutions to use a reviewer 1 and reviewer 2 model, which then goes on, the file then goes on to committee. And in parentheses, I have shaping. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about shaping in the next piece. Here, the second model is CBE, committee-based evaluation, where 2 reviewers, 2 admissions officers are reviewing each file at the same time together. They decide either individually or consensus or however to decide to recommend the applicant for admit, deny, or waitlist. The file goes on to committee and then again to shaping. So shaping is essentially the real black box. I kind of guessed that this was happening, but I think I knew this was happening, and in my interactions with folks in the NACAC spaces, accept spaces, but to the extent that it was happening and what it meant really came through in these interviews. Satisficing is a term meaning just good enough. You're making a decision that's good enough, but essentially after all of these students or applicants have been reviewed and evaluated and recommended for admit, deny, or waitlist, there is a final stage, usually about the week before decisions are released, where students who are recommended for rejection get resurrected, or waitlist people get that term has been so fascinating to me, to be resurrected in the shaping, in the back room shaping with 3 people, or shipping it off to an external consulting firm to do the final predictive analytics shaping of the class. There's a lot of priorities and demands that are happening, and efficiency demands that are pushing and pulling this process in many different directions. I've listed a few here. Revenue targets and financial aid budgets are the top central demands that are shaping that final admission decision. The second thing that I'm hearing very commonly and kind of interchangeably has been the balancing of sex assigned at birth in the cohort. And predicted yield. So these 3 things, actually I'll add in mean and median ranges for tests and GPA, high school GPA, have been also very up there. There are checks for racial diversity. I'm not really seeing that the racial or ethnic background of students being very central. In many cases in the interviews I've had to ask, like, does race come up in this final process? And people have said, like, oh yeah, it comes up, but it's kind of an afterthought that it's so far down the list, I think, in this race conscious process that it becomes an afterthought, a lot, kind of like, let's check to see the racial diversity, but at the end of the day, the main question is, can we afford this class? Even for highly selective institutions, we know, I think that something that doesn't get talked about much publicly has been, the public divestments across the board around higher education. And so, and then for some of these private institutions, they are tuition driven. And so what then, the questions that come up for me now become, well then, when it becomes an issue of can we rely on the tuition revenue for our budgets to keep the lights on and to pay the bills? What students then lose out on these opportunities? And can we really balance, all these priorities to then continue to maintain diversity, racial diversity? I think there's a lot of questions I have. And again, I'm still in the midst of thinking through all of this data, but yeah, that's what I got.
Awesome, thanks. We're sort of shockingly ahead of schedule, which is amazing, which means we've got a lot of time for conversation. And we've had a few questions come in. I want to encourage people to continue to add those either in the Q&A or in the chat box or from Facebook land, but we've been collecting some here that I wanted to invite our academics to comment on, specific to the stuff that they brought up. And some of them were really interesting. I felt that there was a theme that emerged across a couple of these presentation topics related to language and the language used in the process. And it seems that there's it's a really difficult thing to try to manage and moderate, especially if you're a leader in the enrollment office and you want to help people have better, stronger, more inclusive discussions about what's going on, like whether it's in the recruitment process or in the read process. You know, I remember it's altogether too easy to start talking about good versus bad, you know, as opposed to high or low or relative to the context of the student that they're reading and all that kind of stuff. But one of the questions that came up from a leader in an enrollment management position, is there a good definition of racially salient, Ted, that can be used in an admissions office when they are training readers to be mindful of that? You've got to unmute yourself.
So I have a definition in an article of mine that I can share, but basically, I would think one would need to communicate to their staff that that an individual's kind of racial presentation, their interests and involvements with respect to racialized matters shouldn't be, they shouldn't factor in as a negative. I mean, if anything, it should be a positive at most of these places. If they populated their institutions with students that were more racially salient, maybe they'd more quickly be able to solve these intractable issues or at least ameliorate them. But basically it has to do with an individual's presentation of self with respect to racialized involvements, but it doesn't have to be solely one's racial politics. It can be one's attire, how they wear their hair, it goes beyond racial physicality, one's interests and involvements, etc.
There was a question about the difference between calling a phenomenon race-conscious admissions versus affirmative action, right, OiYan, and that there's a lot of commentary these days, obviously, in light of what's going on with the Harvard situation, trying to kind of get at which might be a better descriptor for what is going on. The questioner asks, would you consider race-conscious admissions and affirmative action different? And how do you explain the difference to the average educator in admissions and the counseling realm?
Yeah, it's a great question. I will point people to Liliana Garcis's work. She has a really great short essay on the difference between, I believe it's in the conversation or elsewhere, but I'll find it and I'll send it soon to the chat box and on the Facebook Live comment. But essentially, what we have today is race-conscious admissions, which is different than affirmative action. It is, if you trace the history of affirmative action, what we have today is just not affirmative action. In fact, Justice Sotomayor during the Fisher case said, we don't even have race conscious anymore. We have what's essentially race sensitive. We kind of acknowledge and say like, yeah, race is there. But the way the legal attacks and the policy attacks have come onto affirmative action have really just, it's what we have left today, essentially. And you have institutions that are so afraid, I think, of lawsuit that you have like Ellen Berry and Dan Hirschman's work that suggests that there's a lot of institutions are not even doing race conscious anymore because they're so afraid of legal action. In fact, last summer, I think the College of Charleston just dropped race conscious practices altogether and didn't tell anyone. And that caused a stir because people did find out.
How'd they find out?
Probably intrepid students. I'm not even quite sure. I just remember reading, I don't know if anyone on this panel remembers that case or, but I do remember reading about it in the Chronicle or Inside Higher Ed. Yeah, and so Ellen Berry's at the University of Toronto, Dan Hirschman's at Brown. They've been doing a lot of work around this area that essentially this, you know, starting with 1978 with the Beckie case, and then 2003 with the Michigan cases, and then Fisher a few years ago, and now you've got Harvard and UNC. Essentially, it's been a sustained campaign against accounting for race at all, to acknowledge systemic racial inequalities in society. And so you've got, I think Nikki Chun, director of Caltech, she and I were talking about this morning, that basically it seems like there is this intentionality behind affirmative action to acknowledge that there is systemic structural inequalities and stratification by race and sex and so on. But then when it comes down to it, today's practices are simply more, at least also in my research, it's been finding it's just about like, let's just acknowledge that there's differences in high school contexts and educational opportunities, and let's make sure that we're not placing undue high expectations on students with less opportunities. But that's not really fully accounting for the structural inequalities that students are facing in their communities, and addressing that persistence of racism in society and in our colleges and universities. Does that make sense? So then holistic review becomes kind of just like, it's there. And it's not a very aggressive, but it's what we are left with legally. So then it becomes that chatter, I think I remember, it becomes this kind of like affirmative action and race conscious holistic review becoming kind of the same conversation when they're really kind of historically not. Yeah.
I wonder, as I asked that question about the College of Charleston, like, how did you find out? And it's, you know, each of you has done work, you know, researching universities. And I think that a lot of people would likely regard, and OiYan, yours is directly references the black box, right? In terms of the challenges of understanding what's really going on. And I wonder for each of you, you know, I mean, Ted, you had to do secret shopping, right? I mean, that was pretty critical to your research design to do it that way, right? But, you know, what have you learned about how these entities have reacted, or how willing they are to be researched in the way that you guys are doing it? And what kind of reactions have you gotten from them based on the work that you've done? Anybody?
Well, I've had a very positive reception, for at least from the folks that have communicated with me with respect to my research. David Hawkins at NACAC has assisted in sharing the findings more broadly. And so it's been generally good. I don't think anybody wants to be under a microscope, but I mean, the study was done, the findings are convincing, I think. And so I think most of them have responded with me the way I think they should, which is to take it seriously.
Karina, would you agree with that?
No, I think, Ozan, do you want to take this question? I feel like we've gotten kind of mixed results, reactions to the work. Ozan, do you want
yeah, some presidents or presidents of associations have tried to push back or say the data are garbage, or, you know, we're outsiders, we don't know what we're talking about. But I actually think that's been more, that's been less often than positive, or like they're raising important points. And then the bigger, I think the more heartening response has been, and this is really our theory of change, is that we want to collect data about what is actually happening as distinct from what a public relations effort says is happening, or what public relations says this is what we care about. And then when we collect data about what is actually happening, which I think you know, Ted's study is a brilliant example of empirical research that does that as well, then we can have a conversation of based on what is actually happening. And we have found that one thing this can do is empower local actors that are committed to access. So we have a lot of examples of people using our data to start a conversation with university administration, and that could be people inside an organization, maybe an Office for Equity and Diversity Inclusion, or it could be alumni or community stakeholders that are on the periphery or external to the organization. You know, Karina, of course, you're too humble, but you know, this whole project started with off-campus recruiting, work on recruiting, when Karina and I were sharing our stories of college access, and I was basically like a B student, like literally graduated in the 50th percentile of my high school class from a very rich suburb. And I was shocked when like I got brochures from like 80 colleges and universities, and Karina was like a 4.2, you know, third in her class, every AP class, and didn't get a brochure from any four-year university, and her high school didn't get visited by any four-year university. And so when Karina, you know, that was 3 years ago when we had these conversations, but when Karina presented her dissertation research, which she defended at her old high school, it showcased that she was like, you know, University of Arizona doesn't come here, other universities don't come here. But after her dissertation defense, sounds like people called some high ups because they came up with a policy we need to get more students from Sunnyside High School District, and they have, you know, now hired someone who's solely responsible, or they're hiring someone solely responsible for working with Sunnyside School District. And so I think that it just, one thing researchers can do is just shine a light about what is happening that we haven't discussed it before, or things people know about and they'll talk about at a conference, in a bar, but they won't say up front, because once you bring that to light, I think it changes the conversation, and we see some cool things that are happening because of that.
Karina, there's a question that came up asking about, you know, basically, what do we know about any kind of degree of any relationship, correlation with when it comes to state funding for these public institutions and their visiting habits, both sort of within and out of state?
Sure, yeah, and I think, you know, in regards to the correlation to state funding and recruiting practices, at least for these 15 public research universities, I think there's certainly a correlation, and there's a link that we found. But there's also a but. We find that universities with the weakest state funding amongst these 15 universities, I think it's University of Alabama, University of South Carolina, certainly heavily focused their recruiting efforts out of state. I think for University of Alabama, it was the upper extreme. They had like 90% of their total recruiting visits are happening to out of state schools and communities. And so there's certainly a link in regards to how heavily universities are recruiting out of state. But what we did find as well is that universities that are facing similar state funding and demographic trends within their states did exhibit substantially different recruiting patterns. I think this is the example of UC Berkeley and UC Irvine. UC Berkeley, although they did not recruit more out of state than in-state, their recruiting practices in-state are vastly different to the recruiting practices of UC Irvine. UC Irvine is a really good example of recruiting heavily within kind of your backyard and recruiting within low-income communities of color, versus a lot of the recruiting visits by UC Berkeley were happening in some of the most affluent, predominantly white communities in California.
Have you done any looking into the race of the recruiter and the extent to which that has had an impact?
No, we did not. We unfortunately don't have the way that we're collecting data right now. We wouldn't necessarily have, the race of the recruiter and how or where they're going specifically.
Along those lines, OiYan, do we know anything about how having admissions representatives of color may impact the process of evaluating students of color? Asks one of our viewers.
I actually am not collecting data on the demographic backgrounds on the people I'm interviewing.
Is there research out there that you might be aware of that somebody's done on that, or is that
I throw this back to my colleagues if folks know about this. It's a good question.
I don't know if Michael Bastido's research on implicit bias had anything to address that issue or not.
I think Mike's work, I think it may have been limited to white reviewers. I think Kristen Glasner is in the audience tonight, so she's one of the collaborators and co-authors.
Does Bastido and Bowman have a paper on this?
Yes. Okay, there you go. Mike Bastido and Nick Bowman have a paper on this. Yes. But connected to, I think, Ted's work is, I think it's still an unpublished paper that they've been working on around that Mike presented at ASH in 2017 around when you have more information, the review scores are higher for all students, all applicants, with the exception of Black applicants, right? And so I think that connects really interestingly with Ted's work. They haven't really been able to explain, they've been asked like, why is this the case for African-American applicants? But I think they're still working on figuring that out, but I think this really connects nicely with Ted's work.
I asked that question of him at the University of Rochester Secondary Schools Conference, and he said there's exactly what you said, because that's the question I wanted to know. And he wasn't willing to speculate. I was looking for him to attempt to do that, but
Ted, while we've got you on the line, is there any research or way to distinguish the difference in recruiting and enrolling first or second generation Black immigrant students versus African American students, which is a question that comes from.
I mean, if yes, I think that one could design a study like that. I mean, these audit studies are just extremely time-consuming endeavors, particularly if it's not automated. And you're actually manually sending each and every email. But if you were using the correspondence approach, you could construct narratives that had affiliations with the Caribbean Student Organization or the Haitian Student Organization, or
my wife is an academic, and I have to tell her, can you speak to me? And I don't understand what you're saying. What do you mean when you say correspondence and stuff like that? Can you?
Oh, my bad.
Can you decode the research design?
So so there's two types of audit research. There's field research where like Diva Pager's work, the late Diva Pager, who did the work with the labor market studies when you send trained testers out. So that's the field audits. And then you have correspondence studies where you're communicating remotely with phantom individuals, fictitious individuals. And so if you were going to design a study with the generation, first or second generation versus, let's say, African Americans who trace their ancestors through slavery and in this US context, you would just write the emails and in such a manner that they would present differently. And you could even test, prior to doing that, you would probably want to test those cues, because there wouldn't be anything, to my knowledge, known about that. So you would need to test the cues, probably like you would test the names, the racialized names. And then once you've done that, and you have these powerful cues that signal that kind of West Indianness, let's say, or something like that, or somebody from a particular African country, you'd have to signal that to them some way. But it could be done.
Really interesting question from somebody who sounds like they're perhaps maybe even on the road as we speak. Question from the admissions, in terms of admissions visit research. How do we meet students where they are? I've visited schools and had 0 students see me because according to the counselor, they didn't think they were good enough. And I want these students to know that they are good enough. Do I email them more, postcards, show up year after year and hope one year they'll see me?
Is that question from
that is from
anybody in particular?
Nope.
Admissions counselor? Is that an admissions?
Sounds like this is from an admissions counselor. Yeah.
I mean, I guess if you want to do the difficult work, if you want to engage in anti-racist work in the current climate we live in the racial and political climate we live in, then you got to go above and beyond. I'm not saying this person isn't doing that necessarily, but let's assume that they work a certain number of hours a week with what they're doing now. There's probably ways to work smarter, but you're probably going to have to do more, and you're going to have to put in the time. And so maybe in some of your personal time, you should engage in some of that work. You could document it if you wanted to share with your supervisor. There's extra labor you've been engaging with, but just chalk it up to the struggle. So you're going to have to do more. And so I would say yes. I mean, I don't know the empirical answer. Like, yes, postcards, if they're sent, will generate this level of responsiveness and will change their sense of self. But I do think that one would want to do more and more and more, make more visits on one's personal time, that kind of thing. That's one approach.
This is something that I think I've been struggling with in terms of looking at the research that we've done and understanding that there's, we've shined a light on a lot of the problematic practices that are happening, but how do we change this? But I think, apart from placing a lot of the burden on individual recruiters, I think there's also, as a field and admissions, as a larger kind of admissions field, we need to think about how current recruiting practices are based primarily on the college choice process of upper income white students. Right? A lot of these visits require blocked out entire days, require students to get out of class, require students to, come to college fairs at night, require parents to, do this. A lot of our events are happening at like coffee shops. And so trying to think critically about how our own practices are not in line with the college process of low-income students of color and that are attending under-resourced schools primarily.
And Ted,
also,
go ahead, Ozan.
And it's a great question, and I do not know the answer to that. I think whoever asked the question would know a lot more than me because you're on the road and doing this. But I think that one thing that that folks could do is examine what are military recruiters doing and what are recruiters from for-profit universities doing, because these organizations have been much more successful at recruiting students of color from communities of color. And this is like often the feedback that we've gotten on Twitter from people like, oh, now I understand why it's only military recruiters and for-profits that came to my high school. And they often just go directly to the classroom and just find students. Now, whether you can do that, there's like I guess a question of resources, but I think part of an issue is if the university you work for doesn't feel that this is a pressing priority and it's all supposed to be extra work on you, that makes it really tough for you. And so the goal of our research is to talk about what are the enrollment priorities of universities based on their marketing recruiting behavior, with the idea that we should have a conversation about university enrollment priorities. Because I think if we change university enrollment priorities, which are, it's more than any one person can do, scholar or practitioner, if we change their enrollment priorities, people will figure out how to get students that match their priorities. And so that's where I put the emphasis. Like an enrollment management consultant can tell you this is how you get these students if they decide this is the most important student for you to get.
I wonder, because there's a conversation going on in the chat about, getting support from leadership to do the work. And we're blessed with some leaders who need no convincing on this account, some of whom are here listening to this, but there are others who aren't, obviously. What do you guys have to say? I mean, in the interest of hacking the gates, coming up with some new ideas and moving forward and changing the system here, what can you say to, folks who are, frontline admissions counselors that really need the support of leadership to make these kinds of things happen in their life? Like what kind of tools or ammo can you give them to empower them to make these requests and to see them through?
Karina, you wanna?
It's a nice, easy one, right?
You're in the midst of this right now, Karina. Take a shot.
Yeah, I mean, I guess that's difficult. I think.
Oh, Nikki just used it. I gotta say, hack the hypocrisy. How do we do it? There we go. Hashtag.
Yeah, and I think I like I said, I don't know if this is primarily, it's difficult in a position, with kind of frontline admissions counselors and recruiters, how they go. Obviously, there's a lot of conflicting goals within the institution, and how they go about kind of doing their job, especially folks that are willing to kind of, burn themselves out in terms of doing the good work. But I think there's also room for other people within the institution to change leadership's opinions about what should be happening within admissions. And I think that is, for me, the bigger question is how other stakeholders within the institution can apply pressure and use their power within the institution so that this is not necessarily falling on entry-level recruiters that are paid very, very low, that are doing very difficult work, and that have a very high turnover rate. So a lot of the work that we were doing before looking at the recruiting practices, I was talking with recruiters, and it's obvious that they're in a very tumultuous position, in that, if anything, they're doing something that's not in line with institutional goals or in line with what their administration is doing, they're at risk of losing their jobs. And we see this, there's a really high turnover in admissions recruiters and in admissions positions. And so I think the question really is about how other people within the institution can leverage their power to kind of change administration. And we've seen that we kind of have had some examples of how folks are doing this. We've had several school districts using our data to apply a little bit more pressure on administration to change recruiting practices. And so this is happening from other angles, not just necessarily kind of incoming recruiters.
Really cool idea here from the college counselor side. Is it naive for me to think that explicitly naming Hack the Gates as a movement, as a necessity and obligation in our field should and might have a positive effect for these students to admissions when evaluating them from reading a counselor letter of recommendation?
There's a lot in that question.
Right. So the idea here, like if the counselor throws the hashtag in the letter of recommendation, or the student is made aware of this and names it as a thing, is it a signal that could be considered effective if among admissions readers who are in the struggle?
Well, I mean, I think
I got that right.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like, is that a signal within the, is that like a wink and a nod that I'm on your side, let's hack the gates with this student? Again, that goes to the reading season, right? But at the end of the day, when it gets to the real black box, which is shaping, it seems like, and I see Kristen Glasner had this question somewhere. I've been kind of going back and forth between the chat and the questions about, how many people I've interviewed have access to that room. If you've seen Hamilton, I've been like humming that tune of like, I want to be in the room where it happens. That's the real room where it happens, is that final shaping stage room, which is oftentimes just 3 people. The dean, maybe the director, and maybe an IR person, an institutional researcher on that campus. But if it's not an institutional researcher on that campus, it's an offsite outsourced consulting firm. And there has been one consulting firm that has been named multiple times, very commonly in the Midwest. I'll just leave it there. Getting closer. But I think pretty much a lot of people on this call or watching know exactly what consulting firm I'm talking about. And because it's so common. But
how can you quantify the commonness of it? Like how?
I want to say it's about, and my research assistant Doug is on this call, and he's finishing up with like the first half. We're finishing up on and analyzing the first half of the interviews, and it seems like it's almost 50-50, where it's either in-house or outsourced. But it's, I mean, the most, like the highly selective tend not to have that final shaping stage. That's all done in that committee space, right? So it's an open, more transparent shaping stage where people get resurrected or bumped off or brought back in. But the further down the selectivity you get, so the higher admit rate, I think you get more of this predictive analytics backroom. Is what I'm kind of my gut instincts.
I think we need. I kind of speak to researchers because that's the only group I feel like I could hold accountable and not be completely full of it. But researchers, we need to do a better job studying things in addition to admissions. And I know Karina and I are trying to do that, but Ted study is a great example of he's studying the stage of inquiries. You know, how do universities respond to inquiries in order to, you know, shape who applies to the university. And I mean, if we look across all colleges and universities, the vast majority of programs are, you know, either open access or close to it. And even at very like fancy Ivy League type institutions, they might have their undergrad admissions that's like super selective, and they have graduate and certificate programs that are open access. And so when we think about what is driving access to higher ed, we shouldn't focus on like who's getting admitted, who's not. It's, you know, what are universities doing? You know, who are they targeting? How are they targeting? That's going to dictate access a lot. And as researchers, we tend to just focus on admissions and ignore these other stages of the enrollment pipeline. And if we did a better job of that, that's kind of a lot of the stuff that counselors are dealing with. Like when you're on the road right now, it's not the kind of which applicants get in stage. It's the, you know, how are you drumming up applications? So if we did a better job, I think it would help you to, you know, create those changes at the ground level.
Let me weigh in with that too real quick. Connecting what Karina said with respect to leveraging individuals higher up, leveraging their power, and what Ozan said with respect to other aspects of the admissions process. Those folks who are listening in now and that are more senior admissions professionals that are involved in the hiring process or have hiring authority, that's actually when a crucial stage that perhaps has not been sufficiently researched. And so, and I would say this extends beyond higher ed. For instance, there's certain criteria. We want to know people have certain hard skills. You hire them for those skills, as well as soft skills. And we think of soft skills like, are these folks able to get along with other people? Are they dependable, et cetera, et cetera? But how about people being intoxicated with colorblind ideology? I think that should be like, we can't hire you. So if most of these entry-level positions in admissions, they're recent, many places, the privates too, they're recent alums, they're recent graduates. Somebody's hiring those folks. So those of you who do have the ability to hire folks, you need to be asking these folks certain kinds of questions. If they don't have the right kind of answer, then perhaps you need to throw their resume in the garbage. If I was interviewing somebody for any position, I would want to know kind of, are they delusional? Meaning like that they think we live in a post-racial society and various forms of oppression don't exist. That person can't work with me because they're living in a fantasy land and we got business to take care of. And so you shouldn't be dealing with these folks. So instead of getting these handsome and good looking young folks that just graduate to be in the admissions office, maybe they need to get some folks that have a kind of critical race consciousness. And so they will know what to do. They will do the right thing. And then those of you who hire them can help train them in all the particulars and things, but you got good people that you're working with. If you start off with people that are friendly and they smile, but they're racially ignorant, at minimum, you know, and some of these, we're assuming that they're all just, I'm assuming from it that they're all just colorblind and naive. Some of these people are just overt bigots. So they're there too. We shouldn't ignore those people. Remember, we're in the Trump era, so there's like 40% at least of the country that is absolutely out of their mind. And so, and with respect to racial matters, even more so. So people that are bigots and people that are intoxicated by colorblind thinking, perhaps those people shouldn't be at the top of your list to interview.
Yeah, I'll add to that is that, so my research team and I were hoping to write up a quick policy brief and report by the next spring around some of these interviews, focusing on essentially Judge Burroughs in the Harvard case left a couple of questions kind of open. One of them, she essentially ends with, we need, these offices need more training around bias. But I would say that it goes farther than just training. What I've seen in these interviews is that people who are working in offices, that it's about a cultural dynamic within the office, top down. It starts with hiring. So several places where I'm listening to these people talk about, like, when I ask them, like, how do you check for biases in the process and in the selection process as well, not just reading, there have been some people who have said, like, you know what, they kind of roll their eyes at me about training, because some of the training that I'm hearing, some places are doing like 1 hour once a year, or 1 hour every other year, or they just go around a table and say, we share our biases with each other before we start reading. But then other places are like, it's top down, it's top down, it's through and through, it's all about the culture. It starts with hiring. Who are we hiring? What is their consciousness? Can we work with them? Do they have the basic, foundational skills to then continue to learn about racism in an intersectional way, right? And so I've been impressed by that. And so I am very skeptical about any kind of training. It goes way farther. One person was talking about, like, oh yeah, as an office staff for funsies, we went to go see Hidden Figures, and then afterwards we had dessert and talked through what that meant for our work. And I was like, I'm not seeing that a whole lot with a lot of these interviews. It's just like those rare few places and people who are talking about this full-on culture where they're reading books together as a staff. They're, sharing and talking about, like, okay, how are we applying this? And then referring back to it during read season or committee season and saying, like, hey, remember this, that, and the other, and like checking each other in the space. I think that requires a certain level of organizational culture.
Yeah, I would, if I can share one thing real quick that I didn't get to in my my talk with what can be done. Let me see here. I wrote an essay based on my study that was published in The Conversation. And so what can be done? I gave four practical ways that, for instance, you could intervene in the process. And this transcends issues of race. This could affect any kind of marginalized group that's experienced any kind of marginalization. And first is chief admissions administrators should, can you see this? Y'all can see this? Familiarize themselves and their staff with the research on this practice. Institute policies requiring admissions counselors to respond to all inquiry emails. And that's it. Clearly, if I only generated a 60% response rate on average, that means that's a problem. And this is the part that there's going to be pushback on, but so be it. Regular random audits of admissions counselors' emails for responsiveness, content, and tone. And this is what, like, I think, OiYan, with respect to hacking the gates and these radically and re-envisioning admissions, this is the kind of stuff that needs to happen, like randomly auditing them for these kinds of things. And then you got to have appropriate sanctions and enforcement to maximize compliance, to get them to do that. And I'm not saying that you fire everybody when they're not as responsive as their colleagues, but they might need to have a talking to the first time and indicate that they're being watched. But this would help generate higher levels of responsiveness for all groups who experience marginalization. So not just, and you could find out if there's any particular counselors. And if you do, over time, you could fire these individuals because they're discriminating against prospective students and applicants. I'll unshare that now.
Yes.
Where can people get that research, Ted, that you'd like folks to familiarize themselves with? How does somebody who maybe doesn't have a pipeline to that sort of track that
Well,
down?
I would get all of our articles and then read who we cite and do that kind of backtracking like that, and you'll see related ideas. And yep, you can follow people online on social media. People have websites and things where they list these kinds of papers. I'm sure you could, anybody, all of us, I'm sure, willing, if people reach out to us, if they have questions, we'd be willing to answer them.
Another practical thing, and maybe Karina, you could speak on this a little too, is in the process of doing our research, we noticed there's a lot of universities where like outreach, heavy quotes, is like a completely separate office from admissions. And I think that creates some problems where, like, they've got one office that's responsible for, pipeline programs that are trying to, increase access for, a particular, maybe it's a community located nearby, whatever. But if it's disconnected from the core office of admissions, and sometimes I've talked to admissions folks, I'm like, what's your interaction with outreach and how do you share information across? They say, well, I don't know. It's not that great. Well, it's all about access and admissions. So that should be in the same office. And then, I think there wouldn't be this is not our responsibility. This is outreach's responsibility.
There's a question about the enrollment management companies that are used to shape the classes, and the question is about the metrics and criteria used and sort of who determines those, and that this might be a place to focus some hacking. What would you say about that, OiYan?
Yeah, I mean, I think a couple months ago, I may have posted in the Accept Facebook group where I was like, how many of y'all use outsourced firms? Because I think I was just getting this sinking feeling that I was not studying the right black box, and I just discovered the real black box. And I think the criteria, the variables used in the predictive analytics really is determined by the institutional leadership, likely the trustees oftentimes, I think. So it's really high up there. But they're basically these consulting firms, and also the IR staff, if it's in-house, are giving you kind of, if you weight this more, then this is what but at the end of the day, the key criteria are, the key question is, can we afford this class, right? Again, we're talking about not the full-on Joneses, but the folks who want to be the Joneses, right? Like they're chasing that Kardashian level of money, and so then they're kind of it's so they have a limited budget, even when they say, like, we're need blind and so on and so forth. For the most part, they're not. Like, they're still gonna, or they're meeting full need. To meet full need, you still have X budget dollars for financial aid. So that also, like, questions of yield, what's the likelihood of the student coming or not coming, I think it's all worked in to these predictive analytics. And I'm not a quantitative scholar here, but I kind of theoretically understand it's like, if you want this class to look like this, how much is it going to cost? And it's multi-layered, right? Like, if you want the sex balance, that was, I think, surprising how high up there sex balance is, especially because they don't want male and female imbalance. You can't have too many females at a lot of these places for whatever reason, because there's a males in higher education crisis, I guess, according to a front page story I remember 10 years ago in the Chronicle.
There's a question about that's referencing an op-ed that ASU's President Michael Crow wrote, the statement that he made in particular, saying that being a college that maintains high academic standards but don't burnish their reputations based on the number of students they can exclude, and that there's a lot of work on highly selectives and perhaps not a lot of focus on those of us, that's the questioner, doing access work at R1 publics. Thoughts?
Karina, why don't you take this?
Yeah, no, I think in this particular instance, President Michael Crow has a really good point. But yeah, I think, for my research, I'm particularly interested in public research universities for this reason, that there's most of the work that's being done within admissions is done for elite universities, highly selective universities. But when we're looking at who's doing the brunt of the work to increase access for low-income students and students of color, primarily public research universities and public comprehensive universities. And so I think there's a lot of work that needs to be done in understanding the unique circumstances of these particular institutions when it comes to looking at their admissions and enrollment management practices.
Mm-hmm. I think also something, Karina, your chapter that you're working on right now, your sole author one from your dissertation. I mean, there's also a question we have is, like, to what extent are these public universities really ignoring communities of color? and they want to get their racial diversity from much more affluent places. And you know, the results that we found suggest that like even if like once you hold income and student achievement constant, a lot of universities are less likely to visit communities that are more non-white. And so I think it's somewhat different than Ted's research, but I wonder if there's some like overlap where a lot of universities, they are not going to be comfortable with students from communities of color. They want students who are from predominantly white communities, and if that's the case, we need to identify whether that's happening, and then we can discuss what to do about it. Ted, have you seen that at all in your research?
No, I've focused on privates. All of the institutions were private. But it made me, when you were speaking, I was thinking that I'm sure that there are stereotypes that many institutions have of particular groups that, like, I'm thinking like Blacks and Latinos in certain areas and their behavioral practices that they perceive to be a problem for their campus. Now, it might not have to do directly with kind of anti-racist activism, but more of just kind of crude stereotypes about the that connect to perceived pathological cultures and things of that nature. So they're probably saying like, let's go to these other more well-resourced areas where we can be better likely to get Black folks and Latinos who know how to behave themselves. That's probably what they think.
And I think like a lot of assumptions about achievement that are, you know, just wrong, because like we see a lot of redlining in which high schools get visits, which ones don't, who gets emails and brochures. Like when universities say they're going to buy all the contact information from these prospects, they often do so by selecting based on individual zip codes, and that's where a lot of, I think, discrimination can happen if you completely ignore folks, the high achieving students in certain zip codes. They never even have a chance.
It starts with the name buys.
Yeah,
absolutely. And then what you're bringing up here, and I know we're running out of time, but what you're bringing up here, it just like, I remember one interview where the person said, you know, we recognize that our campus is predominantly white, and we want to make sure that the students that we bring on here are prepared for that kind of culture. And there's something to that effect, right? Like that the students of color that we bring on are going to still thrive despite this kind of reality on our campus, right? And so I was like, okay, that's an interesting, I mean, I think it was a well-intentioned comment, but it goes back to, I know NACAC's closing keynote this year was, forgetting his name, but he was basically like, Jabari? Sellers, yes. And I think Jabari's actually on, I saw Jabari listed in the participants here tonight. So shout out to Jabari, and, you know, questioning and really challenging the construct of fit, right? And our assumptions of fit. But yeah, at least one person I've interviewed has said something to that effect, where it was kind of this said with an intention of care. Yeah.
We are out of time. And obviously could go on all night. You guys are awesome. And I'm honored to have been able to moderate this in some small fashion here. And so I'm going to toss it back over to Marie to wrap this up for us. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you so much. Thanks to our really spectacular panelists, and to OiYan, to Davin, to everyone. You know, I think a lot of us on the call or tonight are a lot of practitioners and folks who feel like so seriously what you're saying, like those are our experiences. And so we want to help take this great work and apply it and hack up these gates. And hopefully we'll see y'all in DC. Thanks, everyone. Good luck with Sucktober, and hack those gates. See you later. Bye.
All right. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.